Dr. Louise, thank you so much for that introduction, and it's good to be here with you all this morning. I also, like Dr. Louise, just want to say thank you for taking the time. I know as pastors and ministry leaders, you're no doubt busy in your world, and it means a lot to just slow down and have some time with you this morning. And just I hope you hear this, our care for pastors and the local church, and some of what Dr. Luis is sharing there about Whitestone and the vision and hope of Whitestone, but also for each counselor that works with Whitestone. Our desire is to be a supportive resource for the local church, for pastors, for teams, for boards. And what we all want is for wholesome flourishing for pastors and churches. Luis, could you hit the next slide, please? What we're hoping to talk about this morning is some of the current information as we have it with regard to what burnout is. What we know is some of the current data shows us that there's seems to be a significant shift within pastoral ministry, and that means that we probably want to slow down and give some attention to that, and think about, like, what are some resources for pastors who have perhaps felt the sting of burnout or even depression, and yet still desire to have some time in ministry that's wholesome and flourishing. So this morning we're going to devote some time to getting a working understanding of what burnout actually is and the conditions that lead to burnout. We'll also highlight some of the characteristics of depression, explore also the distinctions between depression and burnout. What's the real difference between the two? And then move to review some recent data published in the wake of COVID, and wrap up our time. We hope to identify some pathways of flourishing within pastoral leadership, and then provide some time for questions at the end if we have a chance to do that. So let's move to that next slide. And before we get started with the information, it's helpful for us just to move into a space of formation and even ask this question, like, well, what is wholesome flourishing? And I really believe that if we were to ask Jesus, if we could ask Jesus, like, what would it mean for me as a pastor or as a ministry leader or someone on a team at a church, like, what would it mean for me to work toward wholesome flourishing? I think what we might hear from Jesus is what we hear from Jesus in Matthew 11. I think Jesus would give us that invitation, come to me, come to me. And so I would like for us just to listen to these words. I want to read them slowly, these words of Jesus, and invite you just to let them sit in your soul this morning as we turn and talk about some challenging things for church, for pastoral leadership, but to savor these words as we move into that space. Jesus says, come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light. Jesus says, come to me. Jesus is the resource. He always is the resource. He's our source, our true source. And there's so many places in Scripture where we're invited to abide in Jesus, abide in Christ, to find our refuge in Jesus, to take our labors, our work, our heaviness to Jesus, to trust that Jesus will carry us, to rest in Jesus, to think of our relationship with Jesus as comforting as that space we might crawl into our bed at night and just drift off to sleep, that kind of rest, to make Jesus our home in that way. And I know sometimes when we bump into these really challenging experiences within ministry, and maybe you're experiencing some of those right now this morning, it can be hard to come to that place of rest and even imagine what wholesome flourishing might look like for you. And I was reminded this week as I was doing some study of the word manna. You know, the Israelites, when they were in the wilderness, God provided manna, and that word is just so hard to translate. And someone I read said you could literally translate the word manna with a question mark and an exclamation point. You know, it's often translated, "What is this? What is it?" And to think about the way that our Lord works, He doesn't oftentimes take the problem completely away from us, but He gives us what we need in the midst of the storm or in the midst of our wilderness experiences. And we probably will have some moments where we're like, "What is this, Jesus? What's going on here?" And I want to invite us all to remember this morning as we step into these hard conversations and explore areas of burnout and depression, that our Lord still sets a table in the wilderness. And He reminds us that His yoke is easy, that His burden is light, that in His service there is perfect freedom. And so maybe this can be a morning where you just take a step back and re-yoke yourself to Jesus in some way, some around some challenge. It kind of has you wrapped around the axle of something this morning, and you just need to take a step back and remember that Jesus invites you to come to Him. Come to Him first, and come to Him second, and over and over and over in our ministries. When we look at burnout, I would say that most of us have a story. Most of us have some kind of story around burnout. My experience as a pastor, I've been a pastor for over 20 years, and I've worked as a youth pastor. I've worked as an associate pastor, as a church planter, as a lead pastor. So in a variety of contexts, I've worked and served as a pastor. And in early 2023, I was just feeling off. Something was not going well. I couldn't really completely name it. I didn't have as much language for it. And I was communicating this with a pastor friend of mine, and he asked me a great question, a question I'd been asked several times before in my ministry experiences that I'd been able to answer with such ease. But here's the question he asked me. He said, "Do you love the people?" And of course, I love the people that I work with, but for some reason, I just had a challenging time answering that question with the eagerness and gusto that I had so many times in the past. And while I knew I love the people, I knew something felt substantially different. Many of us have a story of burnout. Many of us have a past story, or maybe you're there right now. Maybe you see that happening to a colleague or a friend or someone that you're supervising. Many of us have a story. In 2019, the World Health Organization, that's the UN's global health agency that plays a significant role in classifying diseases and disorders. The World Health Organization identified burnout as an occupation phenomenon. So that's the wording that they chose to use here, an occupational phenomenon. And the WHO described burnout like this as resulting from chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed. Chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed. And I hope we can get a chance to talk a little bit more about successful management of burnout in a moment closer to the end of our webinar. But for now, what I want to do is draw our attention to the distinctions between an occupational phenomenon and a medical diagnosis. A medical diagnosis, something like depression, which we'll talk about this morning, that indicates like a chemical imbalance within a person. Something's going on within me, something with the individual, something that I'm experiencing personally. Whereas an occupational phenomenon, it's more descriptive of the environmental stressors around me, the environment that I'm trying to work and move and have my being in. Something's off in the environment. Something in the culture that I'm trying to work in is off. And specifically, the World Health Organization characterizes burnout with these three characteristics. And when we look at these three characteristics, I want you just to imagine the most extreme cases. We're not just talking about a little bit of exhaustion. Of course, a little bit of exhaustion can be daunting, but we think about exhaustion, for example, as extreme. So these three, each of them would be kind of on the extreme end. And when these extremes happen, then the World Health Organization says these are the dimensions of burnout. The first is exhaustion. So we're talking about something that brings extreme depletion. That might be emotional depletion. That might be just, I don't know if I can talk to another person right now. And you might just have that kind of relational, social depletion. But it's also accompanied with this cynicism, extreme cynicism. It's like this negative sentiment that overrides my view of the work that I do. So when I think about my job, when I think about the ministry that I'm a part of, maybe in the past I've loved to do this ministry, but right now when I think about it, negative sentiment, negative thought overrides some of those positive things that I felt in the past. And thirdly, a reduced professional efficacy. I've written it down on the slide as negative self-concept, because what happens in a reduction of professional efficacy is that the quality of our work begins to diminish. So small workloads now move us outside of our window of tolerance. And ultimately, that low efficacy, it leads us to ask ourselves and even believe this, like, maybe I'm not good at this job anymore. Maybe I missed something. Maybe God really wasn't ever calling me to be a pastor, and we'll start to say those kinds of things, and we'll develop this kind of negative self-concept as it relates to our work. Remember, this is an occupational phenomenon. We're not necessarily saying that across the board with everything we think about ourselves, but as it relates to our work, it may very well be that we have this negative sense of self and begin to doubt our efficacy as we're carrying out our work duties and calling. When we look at the types of environments that tend to produce burnout, Christine Maslach, who's a researcher and has worked for years with the Healthy Workplace Center at the University of California, Berkeley, has researched burnout and found that these following conditions relate to what she calls a mismatch between job and person. And so it's really helpful for us just to keep these in view, and we'll come back to these at the end. But as kind of an assessment tool, thinking through some of these characteristics, some of these conditions as they relate to burnout. And the first one kind of makes sense, workload, right? Like we imagine that if our workload, in other words, if we're on high demand, but we don't have the resources we need in that dynamic, that's like a perfect recipe for burnout. And certainly that makes sense to us. This may be the first thing we think of when we think about burnout, this kind of situation. But there are 5 other conditions that Christine Maslach has identified. And the next one is control. In other words, how much say do I have? How much discretion do I have over what I do? Do I feel like I have influence? Third, reward. And that's not so much about how much money I make, but reward in this sense is more about recognition for a job well done. Is there some kind of reward system that acknowledges the work that I do? Next, community. Who are you in regular contact with? And are these relationships, do they tend to be supportive, or can they tend to be a little toxic at times, or challenging relationship at times? Fairness, being treated unfairly or feeling disrespect. You can imagine how, like, if you're in an environment where you regularly feel disrespected, that might lead to some cynicism and ultimately burnout. And then lastly, values. Do I feel a sense of meaning in the work that I do? Do I feel like I'm making a contribution? Specifically for pastors, Barna research indicates that pastors are more likely to stay in their jobs if they align with the mission and feel this sense of contribution, that their work has value, that they're making a difference. And what's interesting about these conditions is that we certainly would, if you've worked in the church world for any length of time, you probably can relate to some of those as, yeah, that these all make sense. But Maslach's research reveals that this is actually true across all vocations, not just church, but like this is what actually would contribute to a context where burnout is very likely when these conditions are present. Dr. Luis? When we take a step back from burnout specifically and we begin to look at depression, I want to just say a couple things about depression. And the first is that it's pretty complex, right? And if we look at depression globally, 5% of the world's population report being experiencing depression right now. That's like currently, not just over their lifetime, but 5% right now. And that's the adult population. And if we look outside of the adult and just look at everyone that would say, in general, have some depression currently, that's about 280 million people globally, adults across the lifespan, children, et cetera. If we look at national statistics in the US, it's around 18% have reported that they have experienced depression at some point in their life. They've been diagnosed with depression at some point. And so that's pretty significant when we look at the United States data, that about 1 in 5 people, just think about that, whether that is something you've experienced personally or worked with someone or have a loved one who's experienced depression. 1 in 5 people, you know, so you may meet 5 new people this week. One of them has likely experienced depression at some point in their life. And so that's pretty substantial for us just to recognize how common depression actually is in not just our society in the United States, but globally. And depression is got some complexities to it, right? Like when someone says the word depression, we might have a particular view of what depression is, but it actually has a lot of variety. And I've listed some of those different ways that we might talk about depression clinically on the screen. The most common of those listed are the first and second, major depressive disorder, and then persistent depressive disorder. And the real distinction there between those two is that with the persistent depressive disorder, that's unfortunately a depressed mood that's lasted somewhere at 2 years or more. And so just kind of keeping that in mind, and I just want to share this information with you just so you kind of see how complex depression actually is, and the variety of depression that we might see in a more clinical context. Dr. Luis? When we look at specifically major depressive disorder, I find it's helpful just to kind of familiarize ourselves with some of the symptoms, the signs of depression itself. And specifically, I may not go into detail with every one of these, but I did want to mention the first two because for anyone to have a major depressive disorder diagnosis, one of the first two would have to be present. In other words, like you would have to experience a deep sadness in your gut, like a sadness that just seems irregular. Sometimes we call that like this emptiness that might come over us, empty mood, sad mood, not just your average kind of sad day, but one that kind of lingers for a time. And then secondly, a loss of interest and pleasure in things that would normally give you interest or be pleasurable to you. So if you read books a lot and you're like, I don't read books anymore, I just can't do that. Or I used to go hiking a lot and I just don't do that anymore. Like those are indicators that maybe I'm kind of stepping through some depressive episode here, and would be good to meet with a counselor to assess some of those things. Of course, there are other diagnostic criteria: changes in mood, changes in sleep, changes in diet. Sometimes we eat more, eat less, sleep more, sleep less. We might feel a little bit more fatigue. We could feel like a failure or a sense of worthlessness, like we let people down. And unfortunately, with depression, one of the real challenging aspects of depression, and one of the, maybe the most scariest aspects of depression, is that it is sometimes accompanied with these thoughts of death, where we think about death more, or even thoughts of suicide. And anytime I mention that, I always just want to say, like, if you're experiencing any of those, please don't hesitate to reach out and work through these. These are not things that we would ever encourage someone to manage, attempt to manage on their own. And there are so many sources of help, including Whitestone and the counselors that work at Whitestone that are in your corner. Dr. Louise? So just looking at burnout and depression, comparing the two, it's clear that these two, burnout, depression, these two experiences can be quite similar to one another. Both of them include fatigue. Both of them include numbing out, or a feeling of kind of loss of interest or pleasure. Both include feeling like a failure, or like you've let people down in some way. They can both include changes in sleep. Both of them can have some sadness. Both could be accompanied with difficulty in concentration. And so it's important then, I mean, you just see how easy it would be to maybe be thinking that I'm experiencing burnout, when what you may be actually experiencing is depression. It would be very important for us to try to identify what's going on as accurately as possible. And one of the key distinctions, it's not the only distinction, but one of the key distinctions is that if I take a time away from my work, if I take a couple of weeks away and it begins to provide some relief around the symptoms, then that may be a pretty good indicator that what I'm experiencing is more related to burnout and less related to depression. But you wouldn't want to just like take some time off from work, maybe, if you're feeling depressed, because that might exacerbate some of the depressive symptoms, because you'll be alone more, and lose some kind of weekly rhythm because you'll be out of work for a couple of days. So again, it's just really important, and part of the purpose of this webinar is to try to at least highlight some of the differences and distinctions, so that you can, whether in your own experiences or as you're working with others, help guide someone or yourself to the appropriate means of care. Luis? We're going to come back to burnout in a moment, but first, I just want to take a look at some of the most recent Barna data from 2022 that was developed in their Resilient Pastor initiative. And there's a couple components that I want to look at. The first is satisfaction, job satisfaction, which relates a lot to burnout. And what Barna research discovered is that 2 in 5 pastors say they've considered quitting within the last year. That's pretty substantial. I'll just kind of let these numbers sit. I'm just going to go through the numbers quickly here, but you'll see that each of them represents some kind of decrease in satisfaction, in a moment, in confidence. 52% say they're satisfied, which actually seems like that might be an okay number until we look at the data from 2015, when 72% of pastors say they were very satisfied with their vocation. 38% were very, very satisfied with ministry at their current church in 2022. Again, a drop from 2015, when it was 53%. And only 35%, so when we look at a younger population, pastors age 45 and younger, only 35% of pastors under the age of 45 state they're feeling very satisfied in their vocation and their work. Luis? When we look at this data around confidence, we're looking at how someone feels compared to when they begin in their ministry. So in 2022, when Barna did this research, only 35% say they were as confident in ministry now compared to when they began. 35%, and 55% have experienced some episode, over half have experienced some episode or a season where they've doubted their calling altogether. Again, that's up significantly from 2015 when only 24% of of pastors say they went through a season such as that. These numbers, the drops in numbers are staggering for us, and they beg us to take a close look, and assess our practices. And why is this? I mean, what's going on? And some of you here this morning know the answer to that question. You know because you're living this right now. You know it to be true. You know it because you're working with folks who are going through this. And when we look at like why this is happening, these are just the top three percentages. There was a longer list if you want to go to that. Barna's Resilient Pastoral Initiative research, you could see more. But the top three reasons why pastors are considering quitting, while pastors are just asking, like, I just don't know if I can do this anymore. At the very top of the list is stress. 56% of pastors say they've considered quitting because of stress. Next is loneliness, 43%, almost half of pastors are feeling lonely to the point where they've considered quitting. And third, which makes sense in our political climate today, political divisions have just been so unmanageable in many ways that pastors are now saying, like, because of the conflicts that I'm having to work through, I don't know if I can do this anymore. Next slide. Yeah, some of you, I think, are hearing this and feeling a lot of resonance with the criteria, whether it's burnout or depression. And while we might agree, and certainly burnout, it's common, it's got its significant challenges. In no way would I ever want to minimize what someone goes through with burnout, especially in pastoral leadership. Here's the question I want to pose. Is burnout an overused term? In other words, is what I am experiencing really burnout? Or do we need to consider that maybe what we're naming as burnout sometimes actually may be something closer to depression? And again, I say that with a lot of sensitivity, and know that that might describe some who will listen to this webinar, who may be listening to it right now. And again, if you're going through that season, if you find yourself there, I just again want to encourage you, don't hesitate to reach out to me or someone at Whitestone, where we can help you find the help that and care that we want to provide, and that is out there. What we know from research is is very likely, as you work with a counselor and other resources, that you can make an impact and grow through even an episode like depression. And it may be true that you or someone on your team, though, is experiencing burnout. And so from here on out, what I'd like to do is just spend some time looking at some aspects of burnout and what to do about it. And first, I'd like to just address, let's see. Can we go back a slide, Louise? Yes. I just want to address this one myth, a myth of burnout. And it's actually almost believable, and I think it's important for us to name it. And it's the myth that burnout is an individual problem. And it's so easy for us to maybe capture it that way, but it's why I believe the World Health Organization is referring to this as a occupational phenomenon. But if we see burnout correctly, I believe what we're going to begin to see is that we can't just fix the person. That there may be like individual issues present, and unfortunately, like a person might actually be going through burnout and depression. They can be co-occurring at the same time, and that is super painful if that's happening. But it would be incorrect and likely harmful to other people around us if we just try to fix them, when burnout actually is more of an occupational phenomenon. And what I want to encourage through this webinar is that we need to see burnout through a different lens than that. What we need to see is burnout more like a signal, or sometimes we kind of use the analogy of of this as like an indicator light on our dashboard. Like when your fuel light is going off, like something's going on that you need to give attention to. And it's not necessarily something wrong with you as the driver. It just like something has to be, there's a deficiency that needs to be addressed. And so if we can begin to see burnout as an indicator or a signal that there's something going on in the work context that needs to be worked through, addressed. Maybe it's the workload, maybe it's the office culture, but something needs to be addressed. And we begin to ask questions as it relates to these particular factors. Next slide, please, Luis. So let's talk about some strategies for wholesome flourishing. And I just want to remind us all, that's our hope. That's our hope for the church. That's our hope for pastors, for pastoral teams, for families that we work with. We want that. We want to invite folks to come to Jesus and find that place of his yoke again. And in the context of counseling, helping someone discover wholesome flourishing I believe, often involves this dual focus. And sometimes we begin to set goals around things that can change. We want to solve the solvable problems. We want to assess for change and try to solve what's actually solvable. But sometimes we bump into these areas that are more intractable, where change may not be as easy or even come at all. And that's where we start to talk about coping skills, things that we might need to adjust or expand our window of tolerance so that we can step more into flourishing, even in difficult circumstances, even if we can't change everything around us. So first, if we correctly identify something as burnout, it's important to assess for change. We need to assess for change. Again, there are going to be solvable problems that we can assess and begin to pinpoint and name. And I think because we know some of the research and some of the things that are out there from the research on burnout, it's really important that we take that research into consideration. And so if we are doing some organizational assessments around our office culture or just the way that we're working as pastors, I think it would be really helpful. I would highly recommend assessing along those particular areas, the conditions that tend to be in place where burnout exists. So beginning to assess workload and, is it even, do I have the resources do I need? Control, how much say do I have? How much influence do I have? How much influence do people that work on my team have? What's the reward system that's set up in my workplace? What kind of community is around me? How are we developing space for community to develop? And respect, are we honoring people with the work that they do? And values. Are my values aligned with the things that we actually do? Are our behaviors and practices in the way that I serve as a pastor or within the culture that I work in, is it aligned with the values that I have? Think of some of the tools that might really help with this. Of course, could be getting a consultant or a coach or a counselor that might be equipped to assess in these areas. But I also want to say, like, you may be able to get a good bead on this yourself too. One thing that I found is that oftentimes we just get into this way of like doing our work and we aren't slowing down to set up helpful feedback measures, feedback loops that would give us good perspective on some of these things. And then oftentimes there's not a great forum to have these conversations where people actually do trust that they can say things to people that maybe are on your board or maybe that are on your team. And so cultivating a context of trust within your team that you can communicate around some of these things if there are in fact deficits in your environment, and creating that forum regularly, being very intentional about that so that these things can be assessed internally. And then if you need to also bring in a consultant or coach or counselor, I mean, that can be a helpful tool as well. But then also assessing some of your value alignments can be a helpful tool. Does my church or organization encourage appropriate amounts of rest and detachment from my work. And I'm using detachment there in a really positive sense, that we just need to have some space to step away, to refresh, to refuel, and then move back in. And one of the really positive things I've noticed over the last couple of years is that I've known a lot of pastors that have taken sabbaticals. And I think that's great, and I really encourage pastors, teams to have some kind of rotation where sabbaticals are present. We often can't take like a 3-month sabbatical. That can be sometimes challenging to swing in some contexts. But what about just taking a month, a year, and providing a sabbatical to people on your team, having some kind of regular rhythm that's not vacation. It's different than vacation, but it's actually a sabbatical. And yet the one real challenge with sabbaticals too is that, in fact, like once you come back from a sabbatical, you may be stepping back into an environment that has the same challenges it did in the first place. And so just being aware of that, when you come back, you may want to share some of what you've seen and studied and observed, so that when you come back in, you're not just going to step back in and get burnt out again in just a couple of months. I think I'll move on to the next slide, Louise, to coping, just noticing the time here. Sometimes change is further out of reach, as I said, and we need to shift our focus toward lowering the burden of stressors by asking ourselves, what are the tools that I have available for me as it relates to coping? And when we think about the three big reasons pastors are considering quitting, leaving their positions, if those are stress, loneliness, and political divisions, again, I think it's important that we take that research into consideration and try to develop coping supports that speak to these. Complex problems sometimes require complex solutions. And so it's not surprising to us that a single source of support probably won't be enough here. Like, we need to develop multiple areas of coping and support. And if you're in that space, I'll just say this, and maybe we'll wrap up with this and provide some time for questions. But if you're in that space where you're trying to build some coping strategies, coping support, I just want to offer a consideration here along this kind of three-dimensional approach of coaching, counseling, and community, trying to take those three areas of pastoral challenges into consideration, of stress, loneliness, and political divisions. Coaching, counseling, and community might address some of those. And with coaching, it's really helpful resource because you can ask someone to come in and they're starting to look at the broad kind of system that you're working in, the culture that you're working in, and they're going to help you see things that you couldn't see, the blind spots that maybe you just couldn't see because you're in the system itself. And so it can be helpful for you to bring someone in that's equipped and skilled to see some things and maybe even do some assessments on your team. Whereas counseling, or I might even put spiritual direction in this category, that particular resource is helpful to identify honest, like where you have honest reflection on yourself, and really thinking through, like, what am I seeing in me? So a counselor, where a coach is looking more systematically, counselors looking more individually, vocational trajectory may be included in there, but also like psychological, social, and spiritual health. And then lastly, I would just say community. 43%, almost half of pastors have considered changing their job because of loneliness. That's staggering to me. And it reminded me of this article in the Boston Globe back in 2017. The title of the article was "The Biggest Threat Facing Middle-Aged Men Isn't Smoking or Obesity, It's Loneliness." And the article just made the case that loneliness is as harmful to us as smoking or obesity. And so the article then just kind of made a suggestion to, especially in that context of middle-aged men, to join a group of interests, like a running club, or doing something that's not related to work, community that's maybe not even related to work, but is healthy and good and encourages you to stay in a healthy spiritual, emotional, physical practice. There's a couple of other contemplative practices that I've listed there. I'm listing contemplative practices primarily. I mean, we could list a lot, like more exercise and time and things that might be just really helpful for you to engage in: diet, sleep, exercise. Some of those areas are certainly helpful. But I've listed contemplative practices because I think, again, they remind us, especially the contemplative spiritual practices, remind us that God is at the center of our pastoral work, that the church is God's church, not ever ours. And the contemplative practices can teach us that art of slowing down in a world where we're just bombarded as pastors with doing. Contemplative practices can teach us how to be, how to come to Jesus and be re-yoked with him. Contemplative practices can help us see more clearly the nearness of Jesus in the midst of leadership storms. And there's a couple of examples centering prayer where you kind of focus on one word or phrase that can be from scripture. You just spend 20 minutes in contemplation around that in prayer. And then a couple of practices there that are really evidence-based practices: deep breathing, sometimes referred to as diaphragmatic breathing, and progressive relaxation, which involves tensing up muscle groups and relaxing them in a physiological sense to address anxiety and the things that we can just feel stored up in our bodies. But we can talk about those more if you have questions about those. I do want to leave some time for questions, and I see that I've run over a little bit already here. So I'll just turn it back over to Louise if we have any questions that we'd like to address here.
Yeah, thank you, Luke, for everything that you've shared. As I was listening to what you were sharing this morning, I was just thinking about when I was feeling burnout, and I was actually burnout. There were a lot of cognitive distortions and thoughts that were coming into my mind. One of the biggest lies that I had to wrestle through was that I didn't have to have my act all put together, that I didn't have to work to deserve something, like taking some time and being mindful about just my limitations, and so I think, helping us by helping us reflect the importance of feedback loops and just having a community is so important. I think the Q&A is available to all of you. And so I would like to ask that if you have a question, you put it on the Q&A, and I'll go ahead and read it out loud and have Luke and I perhaps jump in and provide an answer to your question. So if you have a question, please go ahead and put it in the Q&A. Luke, what would you say has been, if you were to maybe think about this more personally for you, what's one practice that you feel that has been really helpful for you to be able to have a plan that works well for you?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it really is individualized, isn't it? Because I I think sometimes what happens in, especially in pastoral ministry, is you're just bombarded with so many different demanding things that what you can do is lose sight of some of the things that have been really helpful for you in the past. And then also like family time, like if you're a person that has a family, like it can just feel like you've gone through seasons of challenge where you haven't gotten to spend time with your family. So I might suggest, just in general, something that's been really helpful for me is try to revisit some of the things that were interesting to you in the past, did give a lot of pleasure to you in the past, some of the things that might have been good and enjoyable, and try to re-engage with those in some way, maybe in a new way. You may not actually step into that just as easily. You may feel some resistance in some of that, and again, like talking through that with others. But give yourself permission to try something that used to be enjoyable for you in the past, or maybe even some subset of that you haven't tried. That might be an interest. Like if you, for example, if you're a runner, some people run for exercise, and if you've always run on a treadmill, try going out and running a trail somewhere, or try to mix it up a little bit. If you like to travel, try going for weekend trips if you can get back by Sunday, or taking a Friday off, just again, re-engaging with things that have been good for you in the past that give life to you, that kind of help you be fully alive.
Yeah. Yeah, those are great. Yeah, thinking about what works for us individually, I was reading a book not so long ago about at least a concept that we can think about, such as playfulness. And
Mm,
what does playfulness do for us? And being able to take some time and just be playful with our children, or playful with our spouse, or just playful in general, can bring about those positive emotions that can give us a burst of energy, a burst of joy. So that's something that I've taken personally and been more mindful about. So last
mm,
week, we got some snow, as you know, and I went out and built a snowman, and it was fun. Did a little snowball fight with my daughters, and it just brought a burst of energy in me. So thanks, thanks.
mhm. That's
Oh,
great.
yeah, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, we're in the middle of winter. We have maybe some participants here who are in the cold, and going out for a run might be a little bit more difficult. Do you have a strategy that comes to mind for those winter months?
Yeah, the winters are just really challenging, aren't they? And what we do know, in fact, one form of depression actually is seasonal affective disorder, and it can increase some feelings of depression for sure, right? Less daylight, etc. You know, I think there are some ways that you can engage still in some things, not maybe so much stuff outdoors, but again, like maybe, and again, it's very individual, isn't it? It's very individualized. I think about some of the things that I used to do when I lived in the upper Midwest in the winter, and some of that might be like beginning to read more, variety of things. If you're a pastor and you've been reading like regular uh, books around like research for your sermons, you may want to begin to read a novel, or get into a novel series. When I moved here, I started reading some books from an author whose name's Wendell Berry, and he's a kind of a Southern author, and has written some books about southern towns in Kentucky where he grew up. And I mean, so finding a way to like get into like maybe a variety that would carry you through the winter in a way. It may be like if you're married, finding ways to like set a date night every couple of weeks, if you can swing that, if you can find a way to like manage that. And all these come with challenges, of course, right? And they require some thoughtfulness and intention, but giving yourself something to look forward to. If you're someone that likes to go out and do things, can you kind of schedule a date night, or go to a concert, or just try to spend more time with friends, as it relates to just being cooped up inside for such a long time. And so, yeah, I do think there are things that we have to be creative with, but the lie is, well, I guess I've got to just kind of hole up here and not spend time out, and do anything, and just kind of weather the storm. And that maybe speaks to some of the cognitive distortion that we can sometimes feel, Dr. Louise.
Yeah. Well, thanks. Thanks. We have a few questions, Luke, that are popping up.
Mhm.
One question is, how many hours of work do you recommend as a pastor or church planter should work?
Oh
Um,
yeah,
and here the pastors are always on.
yeah. That is a significant challenge. I just want to say, I have a lot of empathy for pastors in a variety of contexts, and it can be so hard, and there really isn't. I mean, number one, like even trying to like count the number of hours you just worked in the past week can sometimes be immobilizing. It can just feel daunting, and can create some challenges within your marriage if you're married, and family life. And so, is there a recommendation? I mean, I certainly wouldn't recommend working much over 50. I think realistically, it could be really hard for pastors to work a 40-hour week. So if we're trying to be realistic, it's probably not likely. you can swing that. But if you can, if your board is supportive of that and you're trying to align around that value and you say, okay, we're going to hire staff so that we can manage our schedules in effective ways. And maybe some of the things, one of the things I didn't talk about as much in the conversation was that we can have this overactive, pastors can have an overactive sense of responsibility. It's because we're helpers and we just want to help people and we're eager to step in and help. And so maybe some of that work is to work with your team to develop a work schedule that's realistic. And I would recommend bringing our spouses into that conversation so that we work together with what our families need of us as well and prioritize what we hear from our spouses, something that can be really challenging to pull off. But also ask yourself really candidly, like, am I saying yes to too many things? Do I need to work on just saying no to people and finding resources for them that I can help them introduce them to and build a team that would be that. That's super hard to do if you're a church planner, though, I will say. And so these aren't easy, and I certainly am not trying to minimize any of that question.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things that I've come to recognize, I mean, at one point I was working three full-time jobs or two full-time jobs and a part-time job and a graduate student, and I was burned out. And one of the indicators that I was overdoing it was that I didn't have margin, and that was causing irritability. It was causing
Mm,
frustration. It was costing me to count how many cars were on this lane at a red light versus how many cars were on this lane. And so just see some of those indicators I think can speak as to changing maybe the hours when we begin to neglect the things that we value, such as our relationship with our spouse or our kids. Those might be indicators too, which I think you mentioned in your presentation. We have time for one more question, and I'll read it out loud. It says, "How do you find a counselor who understands the complexities of the pastoral role?"
mhm, mhm. Well, I think the the beauty of counseling is that you can begin the process with a counselor and ask some of those questions at the very beginning. And you may ask them, especially I think at Whitestone, one of the good things about Whitestone is the majority, many of our counselors have experience with ministry, and many of our counselors at Whitestone would understand some of those complexities within pastoral ministry. So I would recommend asking specifically, have you worked with pastors in the past? You know, and if you've got specific areas that you'd like to work on, that would be helpful to ask in a phone consultation before you start with counseling, or maybe in the first couple of sessions. And I always say when I'm working with folks, like, hey, if you start with me and we're working together and you're feeling like it's not the best fit, then let me know what you're looking for because I'm eager to help you find someone that is a better fit. And so I think we're all committed to that in the field of counseling. Like we want what's best for the people we're working with. And so I think the real answer to the question is just honesty, openness, and communicating what you need as much as you know, and then learning how to kind of move toward that and trusting the process of counseling. And again, with Whitestone, I think many of our counselors would be very equipped
Mm.
to fill some of those experiences and help guide you through that.
Yeah, yeah, that's a great point. It's important for everyone to know that there's this like a chemistry call between you and your coach or you and your counselor. And counseling does work best when you feel like there's a good fit between you and the counselor. And asking those questions in the initial session or consultation phase, I think would be really helpful. Well, Luke, I want to thank you so much for taking time. Again, Luke is one of our senior clinicians, supervisors at Whitestone, and he has a lot to offer, a lot of experience, and I think that can really help him come alongside of your journey as a pastor or church leader. So reach out to Luke or reach out to our team. Thank you so much for investing in you and taking the time this morning to join us. Have a wonderful rest of your day. God bless. Take care.